What's up, guys, and welcome to the Rebalance podcast, where we dive into topics that matter most when it comes to overcoming struggles, injuries, and finding balance in your life. Everybody's idea of balance is that bit different, so my goal is to give you different perspectives, practical tips, as well as expert insights into what it means to live a balanced life. My name is Robbie Cassidy. I'm a physiotherapist and a health coach, and I've been helping people reignite their love for challenge, overcome their fear, and find more balance in their life through the process of self-development. So, let's get into it. What's up, guys, and welcome back to the podcast. On this episode of the podcast, we're going to look at 3 tips to manage an ongoing injury while you're still training, because a lot of times you get these injuries. It may be in the middle of a season, it may be coming up to a race or coming up to a competition, or you just want to keep training because the injury isn't that severe and it's going to need to take time to heal anyway. And what I'm going to give you is a couple of tips that will help you to stay in training as long as possible while you manage this injury on the side. And I'm going to just talk about principles mostly, because principles are going to be the most important thing here. Because if I give you these, then you can start to get an understanding of how to manage your own injuries and your own issues. It's probably better to look at this as issues as opposed to injuries, because there's some injuries that you need to really just pull back, and it's not going to be the best thing to continue training on them. But the majority of them, you're able to manage them well by just managing your load and managing what you do. And to start off, I'm going to address some of the common issues that people deal with, because a lot of people are going to run into the same issues when they start off. The first one is a lot of times when you get an issue or an injury, you don't want to sit out of training completely. You want to continue doing little bits and pieces to make sure that you're able to keep up to date and that you're not missing out on the skills, as well as you're not deconditioning that much. Because deconditioning is going to be probably one of the biggest factors related to re-injury or related to having a new injury when you're coming back, is that you're just not up to the same speed and you're trying to push, but it's not there, and the body breaks down as a result. So that's the first one, is you're missing out on skills, deconditioning, lacking the speed. If you're involved in a team sport, it's going to take you a couple of training sessions to get back up to the speed. So if you're able to keep in the small sided games, or if you're able to keep in parts of your sport or parts of your activity that you're able to keep the skills up and the speed of those skills up, it's going to make it a lot easier to when you do get back to full training, that it's not an issue for you. And sometimes it's more important to be involved with the team as it's coming up to, let's just say, championship, for an example, where there's a game coming up. You know your ankle is at you a small bit, you know your shoulder's at you a small bit, but you don't want to pull back completely, because it's not going to keep you out of the game, but it needs time to rest and recover. And they're the ones that we're really looking at here. Okay, I always push a proactive style in rehab. I always push that idea of making sure that you're doing the little bits every day and you're doing what you can to get back sooner rather than later. That's the approach I always take, because I think there is too much of a push on just injury, stop everything, give it a couple of weeks and get back, when the research shows that the earlier you start your rehab, the earlier you return to play. And that's the thing that we really need to get into our mind, is that there's always something that you can do that's going to make it a bit better the next day. We're always paying it forward one day. People often look for, okay, right, stop completely and then leave it a couple of weeks. Or, which you're probably more likely to have fallen into this side of things, they won't do anything and they'll look for something to fix it on the day. Okay, and that's what we need to avoid, is like when you're looking at rehab, you're looking at paying it a day forward. So what you do today will benefit you tomorrow. And I think too many people get stuck up in, what's the quickest fix? What can I do right now to fix it right now? Where we need to have that approach that we're looking at, okay, what can I do now that's going to help it by the weekend, and that's going to help me get back into training by next week. Okay, and if we do take that approach, even though it's a bit of a reframing in your mind and it can be kind of annoying because you're like, I just want to get back into it right away, it does help, and it speeds up the whole process. And then there's a psychological aspect of missing out on training, because it's like you want to be involved in a group when you're in these training environments. Half of it is the community, half of it is being around the people that you enjoy being around. And that psychological aspect, or even let's say a runner, somebody who's doing an individual sport where you like getting out to clear your head. You want to be moving around in nature. You want to try to be out of the house, so you're just not in the house all day long or just at work all day long. You have these little breaks. So that psychological aspect of missing out is huge as well. And what can happen there is when you do get that, and if you do approach your injuries like you stop and then you you don't do anything at all, and then you wait till you come back, and then you get injured and you stop and you don't do anything at all, what can happen is you nearly get into a depressed mood, because you get this attitude of, why is this always happening to me? Why am I the one who's always injured? And once that creeps in, you'll find that you start looking for really quick fixes, and then you will look to see, how can I fix it right now? And you'll be chopping and changing, and a year will go by, 2 years will go by, and you haven't realized what you've done. And it's the short-term fixes that have actually led to long-term or longer-term gaps in your training. Now, before getting into it, a couple of common myths that I often come across is people think that you still need to rest, ice, and compress and elevate when you get an injury. Completely wrong. Not an option. Don't do that anymore, please. If you don't believe me, look at the podcast that I did before this. I'll talk about that later on. But look at the podcast I did before this on ice and why it's actually ineffective for managing injuries and why we don't want to do it. The other thing is that people want to avoid all pain all the time. You will need a small bit of discomfort in your rehab, because that will then it'll help you to understand where the limits are. And with that, people often say, don't do anything to aggravate it. Although it's well-meaning advice, sometimes you do need to touch off that a small bit, and sometimes as you feel that pain, it's going to help you test that limit, as we will talk about in a few minutes. So, to get straight into it, the first step is, after you get the injury or after you get the issue, you want to start looking at how you can get more blood flow to the area. Now, you have to go through the phases anyway, or your healing phases, where you have your inflammation phase, you have your proliferation phase, and then you have your remodeling phase. But you can do little movements that are going to get a bit more blood flow to the area, take down the pain sensitivity, will continue to work on movement and coordination, and keep your body used to it. It will reduce deconditioning, and as I said before, the little bits that you do during the day are going to pay off. An example of this, and I'm going to use this example throughout, is recently I sprained my toe at jiu-jitsu. I was going for a choke, the guy stood up, he fell backwards, and I hyperextended my toe, so he fell on my toes. I was full sure I broke my toes. It was outrageous at this time. It just was so much pain, but I think my reaction to it caused the pain to be even higher. Now, it is still kind of sore, but I've been back training since. I was able to get into a competition like a week after, so it's improved a lot. Now, the reason I'm going to use that example is I'm going to talk you through how I approached it and why the approach was able to let me get into training and let me get into competition. I probably could have just stepped back and said, no, I'm not going to do the competition, but I wanted to really, I always try to take that proactive approach, and I knew I could manage it well in training. I think it was actually, I'm wrong, it was 2 weeks before competition. I knew I could manage it well, and I knew I could stay in training so that my fitness wouldn't drop off and that I'd be able to do bits and pieces. And it actually gave me the idea to do this podcast as well. So little bits do pay off during the day. If you are just like contracting, gripping stuff, walking on it, like the toe is an easy example because it's easy to move it. So you're walking on it, you're not avoiding it completely, you are practicing coming up and down on your toes. Now this is really sore at the start, but you'll find that the first day you do it, usually the second day it becomes a little bit easier. If it's not easier the second day, you probably did too much on the first day. Okay, really simple way of looking at it. And what we're trying to do at the start is take down the pain sensitivity so we understand where the actual injury is. Because if you think about the size of the ligament or the size of the tendon that gets damaged, or even let's say the muscle, if you get a little muscle tear, it's very small generally, yet everything feels really sore. Like if you sprain your ankle, the ligament, the ATFL ligament that you sprain generally, let's say if you roll your ankle, it's tiny, but your whole ankle blows up and gets really sore because that's the pain sensitivity in your body increasing as a protective mechanism. So we need to, it's not that you've done more damage, we need to take that sensitivity down and really get an understanding of where it is. And when you do start to take it down, you'll figure out, okay, right, if I invert my ankle, it gets very sore. Like just a simple example. If I dorsiflex my ankle, it gets really sore. If I plantar flex and if I overextend or over plantar flex it and evert at the same time, it gets really sore. You know, there's like little movements that are going to be, that's going to hurt you. And it depends on where the ligament that was injured is. And you may have injured more than one. You may have injured a couple of different ones. But you'll figure it out once you start to do those movements, what that feels like. So you have to think about what you can do today that's going to pay off tomorrow. And these little microstressors or little micro contractions can actually help it long term. But too much of them, like too much stress, really pushing it, really leaning into the pain too much, is going to hinder your progress. So get it moving and contracting. Try work on light strengthening movements early on, and make sure then that you're assessing how it feels later on or the next day. That's a simple one. All of this as well, you take it with a pinch of salt if you're not a physio or if you're not a therapist, because it is like I don't want anyone to injure themselves any more than they are, but these ideas will give you a better idea of how to manage it overall. The next one is, so the first one is get it moving and contracting. The next one is focusing on testing the limits of what you can do each day. This comes back to the same idea of what you can do today is going to help pay off tomorrow. So if you feel like it's pain and tightness all around every movement and every range of motion, you need to start just doing little movements around in a circle, finding a point where it is sore, finding a point where the actual injury is, and then touching off it, coming back out of it, and then trying to calm down the sensitivity everywhere else. And it may be that you can't walk for 10 minutes today because you sprained your ankle or strained your toe, but if you touch off that limit, come back, do your movements again, check what it's like the next day. Are you able to walk for 12 or 15 minutes? Are you able to start to do a light jog for 5 minutes? These are the things that you're looking at, is how can I test it a little bit more, find the limit, and then use that as the benchmark that I just need to improve on that. And once you understand what you're able to do, it becomes so much easier to manage it. Like a hamstring. If you tear your hamstring, I tore my hamstring when playing football last year, and within about, it was a pretty bad tear, probably a grade 2 hamstring tear, and I was back training on the pitch in about 5 days. Now that's not saying the hamstring was healed. That's just saying that I was able to get back out on the pitch, I was able to start jogging around, I was able to move around, and I was able to step into hand passing drills on the pitch. And I was just managing it. Like if a ball went way past me in a hand passing drill, I just left it go. There's nothing I could do. I'm not going to overextend and try and get that. What's up, guys? Robbie here. I hope you are enjoying the podcast so far. I want to take a moment just to personally ask you for your help. If you're enjoying the podcast, would you be willing to share it with someone you think would love it too? Maybe a friend, family member on social media, or even if you just brought it up in conversation with someone you know. The recommendation means the world to us, and it's because of people like you that we get to be able to produce this podcast on a weekly basis. So thank you so much for your support so far, and I would love if you could help us reach even more people who could benefit from it too. Really appreciate you, and we're going to jump straight back to the podcast. And that's what it is about, like understanding what you can do. I knew I could start jogging. I knew I couldn't sprint. I could probably jog up to maybe 30%, 40%, and I was going to feel okay. But as soon as I had to start changing direction stuff, I could feel it pulling. So I was a bit careful about that. Really simple example. I do this all the time with all my clients. I tell them, let's jump into what we can do. We'll break down the exercises that they will be able to do with a team or be able to do by themselves, and then we'll say these are the high risk ones, and we'll say let's just avoid the high risk ones for now, because you don't want to injure it anymore. But that's what it is about testing your limits. I know the limit with me when I tore my hamstring was sprinting, or was probably jogging at a higher pace. So I just kept everything underneath that pace. Really simple idea, but it makes such a difference if you can do this. It makes such a difference. So that's a simple one that you can do. If your ankle, it could be that you can't do jumps, or you can't do high jumps, let's say, or you can't do explosive movements. So you come back to the basics of just getting out, walking on it, trying to get in swimming if you can, picking stuff up with your toes, trying to walk on your toes. But you're just avoiding these high speed cutting movements, high speed sprinting, acceleration, deceleration. These things at the start are going to be a bit more of an issue. Now with the ankle, a lot of time it's a tolerance thing. You may be able to do it while everything else, all the other muscles in your shin or around your foot take over. But once they fatigue, then you start to feel the injury a small bit more. So it could be that you are able to actually do a light bit of running, but you can only do it for 5 minutes at the start, because everything fatigues and then it starts to get sore. There's no point doing it anymore, or you're risking re-injuring it again. At this time is when you can play around with like, I'm not against these things at all because I use them myself, is that's when you can play around with things like taping, where it allows you to do a small bit more. Like taping my toe got me through so many training sessions because I knew what I could do. I knew I couldn't push off it. This is in jiu-jitsu. I knew I couldn't push off it. I could still, for anyone that does jiu-jitsu, I could still play guard and play off my back. I wasn't going to stand up and wrestle. And by taping my toe, I was able to stop it getting hyperextended too much by little movements. Okay, if there was a big movement, I just wasn't going to take the risk and I would just avoid it. But just avoiding those little movements helped me massively. So taping was really, really good in that situation. And taping can be really good as well for you with your ankle when you have to play a game. If you sprained your ankle a couple of weeks ago and you have to play a game, a nice little one just before the game. But I would be less likely to tape it for every training session coming up to the game. I would be trying to push it a small bit more during the training sessions when you can manage it early on, and then if you need to, you can start to tape it later on. But it completely depends on what your physio is saying and what your approach is to it. That's the way I would look at it. Testing the limit for when I sprained my toe, what I did to test the limits is I sat down, I put videos of this up on Instagram, I just caught my foot and I wiggled the toe. I know it sounds funny, but I was just wiggling around, basically bringing it into flexion and extension, but really controlled because I was holding it, so I was able to do it myself. And I knew then when I went too far that it was too far. You know when you push it yourself how far is going to be too bad, like it's where the pain really kicks up. But what I was doing is I was finding the tightness, I was working around it, and then I was kind of playing with the pain. I was playing with the pain a small bit. And it's funny, I mentioned, geez, I sound like I was all injuries. After I went to the competition, held up well, got this wrist injury, just a light sprain, nothing crazy. It's actually a lot better now. That was last week. I put up on Instagram a video of me, what I was doing in the early phases. So if you don't follow me on Instagram, follow me on Instagram. You'll see what I'm talking about. It's Mobility Tutor. I was putting up all these movements of what I was doing to help it out. Okay, and then I mentioned it's not a bad pain. It's kind of a funny pain, is what I said. And people wrote to me, what is a funny pain? Like, what is that? Like, how can I judge what a funny pain is? But the way I described it is like when you're playing with it a small bit and when you know where the limit is of it, like to the point that it's going to be extremely excruciating pain, you're not going to go to that point. But there's a lot of pain in between that you can kind of play with when you're controlling it. Like, you can't play with that pain in a chaotic environment where you're on a pitch and you're sprinting and you're cutting and you're doing all this. You can't really play with that pain as much. But if you're just rolling your wrist around in circles, if you're just doing range of motion exercises at home with your toe in that, you can play with the pain a small bit and you're able to control your reaction to the pain. So the pain itself became kind of a funny pain because once I hit it, I started laughing because I'm just doing it here with my wrist even in the background. Once you hit off that point, it's like, oh, you laugh a small bit, and I was like, I probably won't go as far next time with that. So you're playing around with it, you're testing out the tolerance of it, and you're testing out the range of motion of it. So that was a really simple one for the toe, wiggling it, finding tightness and playing with the main. So the first one is get it moving and get it contracting. The second one is focus on testing the limits of it each day, where you know what you can do, whether that's sprinting, jogging, jumping, push-ups, whatever it is, you know what you can do, and then you work around that as much as possible, and you try to keep it at a level that you're, as I said, if you tear your hamstring, you're still jogging. You're not just stopping completely, you're still jogging. You're building up to 30% some days, you build it up to 40% other days, and as you find as it improves, you continue to increase it. That way you don't decondition as much as you do your rehab. You're keeping up to the same, or to a level that's pretty good. Like, it's not going to be to the same speed or anything, but it still helps you out as you get back into training. Now, the last one, so the first one, contracting, second one, test the limits, just so people know. The third one is managing your load appropriately. Really important, especially as you're building up to a game or a competition or something, events that you need to get into. Managing your load so that you have heavy days and you have light days is extremely important. When there's something coming up, you know, okay, that's on next Sunday, so I'm probably going to take Friday, Saturday off to give everything like a chance to heal a bit more and to clear out that inflammation and then that's there. But you can continue to work at higher levels up to that point, so that when it rolls around, that the fatigue has gone away, the neurological adaptation is some way there, has improved, let's say, and that you're not going in there at a higher risk. You're trying to reduce your risk as much as possible, and you have the work done in the background. That's the idea of having your heavy and light days. So you're pulling back a few days before the event. And giving yourself rest days in between is important. Now, an easy example is when I sprained my toe, I got it moving straight away,
I didn't go to training the next day, and I took, but I just got it moving myself. I got walking on it, and I took the next day off after that. So it happened on a Thursday. I took the Friday and the Saturday off, and then Sunday there was no training. So yeah, I took Sunday off, but I was still walking on it. I was still doing all the stuff at home where I could test it, and I was walking on my toes. Monday, got into the gym. I did a lower body session, started to add a bit more strengthening exercises to it, just because I didn't have the strengthening exercises there a couple of days before. I did a small bit on the Saturday, if I remember correctly. And then Tuesday, I got back into jiu-jitsu. I taped the toe, and I was working on just playing guard, keeping off it. Went for a kind of a heavier day on the Tuesday. Wednesday, same idea. So just kind of tested out what it was like. Because I didn't overexert it on the Tuesday and I managed what I was doing, I was able to train okay on the Wednesday. Thursday, I went in the evening time and I got a gym session in. Friday, I was able to do a double session on the Friday, but I taped it. I just played off the ground. Again, nothing too hectic. And then Saturday, I did a light training session, played off the ground, didn't test it too much. But at the same time, what I was doing with these days is I was leaning into it a small bit more. So as the week went on, the Friday and Saturday, what I was doing is I was actually starting to practice moving from my back up to on top. So I was testing it out in those sessions a bit more where I was pushing it to the point that there was a bit of pain. Reason being is there was a competition the next week, and I knew I was going to have to do that at some stage in the competition. So I wanted to find out where my limits were at pace in a training session. Once I did that, I only did that on the Friday and Saturday because I knew I had the Sunday and Monday off. Okay, so I was testing a bit more, finding that limit, testing the strength of it, testing, okay, if I can push up straight, perfect, but if I push off to the side, how does that feel? And okay, right, so pushing off to the side is a bit of pain. If I'm leaning on it and holding it, it gets sore after a while. If someone jumps towards me, it gets a bit sore if I have to try resist that. So I avoided those, but I still touched off them slightly. Now, what that does is it gives you the idea, okay, that I'm able to, on these days, I have my Friday and Saturday, I was testing out the limits of it at a higher degree because I knew I had no choice to do that in the competition anyway the next week. But I knew also that if I did aggravate it too much, I had Sunday and Monday off, and that I was going to get it moving a small bit more on those days. Nothing crazy. So there was planning to that session. There was planning to the higher intensity load at the end of the week because I knew I had 2 days off after that. Then on the week of the competition, I started to push it more on the Tuesday night, and I pushed it even more on the Wednesday. I think I doubled up in a session on the Wednesday because the competition was on the Sunday, actually, is what it was. And then the Thursday session, I was able to do that as well. And then Friday, Saturday, I just took off. So I was continually building it, and then I knew I had a very good idea going into the competition what I could do and what was going to aggravate it. And it also had improved massively by that stage. Like come Thursday, I was able to basically do nearly anything. Not anything, but I was able to play a certain way, or I was able to control the movements a certain way so that I wouldn't aggravate it too much. And that only came because I had my heavier days the week before and I tested the limits, and then I was able to test it a small bit more on the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and I knew that Friday and Saturday I was going to take those off and just go walking out in the street, try get it moving, and like scrunching it up, and the exercises that I was doing on Instagram as well. So you can see there was a small bit of planning to it, in that I knew the heavy days were going to be earlier on. I knew the days I was going to have that were going to be very heavy, I was going to have recovery days after them, and I used the heavy days to test it out a small bit more, to put it into more compromised positions. Okay, that's the reason I did it, is because I knew the couple of days after I was able to rest and recover and relax. I wasn't going to go heavy every day, because then it's just going to get way more sore. You're going to have a lot more discomfort. It's going to hang around a lot longer, and you're not really going to get the proper healing. You don't want it to be really sore all the time. It's okay for it to be lightly sore at times, but you don't want it to be sore all of the time. So that's the way I manage that. Now, hopefully that gives you an idea of what to do. Is 2 weeks out, I had to rest it first. I started to build it up. I had heavier days at the end of the week, and I rested it again. And on those heavier days, I really tested the limits of what I was saying above. And then after that, I had Sunday, Monday off. I came back in Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, and I was able to test it each of those days, continuing to build it up. And by Thursday, I had a very good idea of what I could manage. So I took Friday, Saturday off. Because if I went to Friday, having done the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday heavy days before, there's a higher likelihood that I would have aggravated it too much, and I definitely wouldn't go to Saturday because I think we were driving up anyway, so I didn't have the choice. Friday was like I could have tested it a small bit more if I wanted to, but I felt I got enough out of it the days before that, and I was able to get it to a point that it was that it was working for me well, so that if I just gave it the extra day off, I felt it would help. And in the competition, it was 100%. There was one time, I had 5 matches. There was one time in one match near, I think it was my third or fourth match, that I did push off it, and I did feel it a small bit more, and I remember like, oof, but it because it was a competition, it kind of went away, and it didn't hurt me too much the next day. But so once I started to fatigue, I did touch off it a bit more in the competition. It did hurt that bit more than it had the week before or the while before that, but it wasn't too bad, and I felt that if I hadn't tested it before in the training sessions, that it would have been way worse. That's all I'm going to talk about, is that when you are in competition, when you are training, you want your things to get it moving and contracting. Focus on testing the limits of it each day. Think about paying it off the day forward. What you do today will help it tomorrow. Too much stress is going to hinder it, but microstressors can help it. Manage your load appropriately, and know that your heavy days, you're going to have lower days after that to give a chance to recover on those days. And then some of the frequently asked questions: should you ice it? No, I'm not too keen on icing it. Check out that podcast. It's 151, Rebalance 151, why you need to stop icing your injuries, and it goes into detail on how it can actually delay recovery. I never iced it. I never iced any of these injuries. How much pain is too much? It really depends on you. I don't want to give people that kind of tolerance, because that can be dangerous. Some people will say, oh, it was a 4 out of 10, but they were really dogging it. So it does depend on you. Be smart about it. You need to assess how long the pain sticks around afterwards. If it sticks around for ages after, you probably did too much, so pull back. It's the explosive exercises, it's the uncontrolled ones that are going to cause you injury or going to cause re-injury. So doing those too much can be trouble. And obviously always follow your medical practitioner's advice, because this is just giving you overview and talking about the principles, and their advice is going to help you really get through it, because they'll assess that injury. They'll see what it's like on a day-to-day, and they'll see how it's improving, because everyone heals at a different pace. But that's all from me today. I hope that was able to help you, give you a better understanding of what you can do to continue training while you have an injury or an issue, and hopefully that you have a better understanding of what's too much, what's too little, and ideally you leave this with a proactive approach to your injuries and not a reactive approach or a resting approach. If anyone has any questions, just send them on to me on Instagram. Mobility Tutor on Instagram is probably the best site to get me, or you can email me at info@themobilitytutor.com. But that's all from me today. Hope everyone is doing well, and I will chat to you all again next week. Have a good one.
Okay guys, thank you so much for listening to today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you're looking to learn more about what we do, as well as check out any of the mobility and rehab programs we have available, just head over to the description of this podcast and you will find a link to all the programs there. As always, thank you for listening, and I will chat to you all again in the next episode. Have a good one.